I gave up the night that was supposed to change my life to kneel in the mud beside a stranger, and I have never once regretted it. What I did not know then, as I pressed torn silk against his wounds, was that the stranger would rise as a duke, and that his gratitude would become something far more precious than any ballroom introduction could ever be. My name is Rosalind Whitmore, and I was born into a family that had once known grandeur, but had long since traded it for respectability and quiet poverty. My father, Lord Geoffrey Whitmore, was the youngest son of a baron whose estate had crumbled under the weight of debts and poor harvests. By the time I came into the world, there was little left but our name, a modest house on the edge of the county, and the fading hope that one of his daughters might marry well enough to restore what time had stolen. I had no sisters, which meant that all those hopes rested upon my shoulders alone. My mother, Lady Eliza Whitmore, reminded me of this often, not with cruelty, but with the quiet desperation of a woman who had watched her own dreams wither and did not wish the same fate for her only child. The winter ball at Hartwell Manor was to be my great opportunity. It was the most prestigious event of the season, hosted by the Countess of Hartwell herself, and invitations were coveted like precious gems. That my family had received one at all was something of a miracle, a favor called in from some distant connection my mother had cultivated for years. I was to wear a gown of pale blue silk that my mother had secretly commissioned from a seamstress in London, spending money we did not truly have, because she believed, with all her heart, that this single night could determine the course of my entire life. I believed it too. At 20 years of age, I was not yet considered a spinster, but the whispers had begun. Other young women my age had already secured engagements or at least attracted serious suitors. I had attracted nothing but polite disinterest. I was not beautiful in the way that society demanded. My features were pleasant but unremarkable, my figure neither willowy nor voluptuous, my conversation adequate but not dazzling. I was, in every way, ordinary. But my mother insisted that the right gown, the right lighting, the right introduction could transform ordinary into acceptable and acceptable into desirable. And so I allowed myself to hope. The night of the ball arrived wrapped in winter frost and the kind of crystalline cold that made the stars seem impossibly close. I remember standing before the mirror in my bedchamber, hardly recognizing the young woman who gazed back at me. The blue silk caught the candlelight and shimmered like water. My dark hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that made my neck appear longer and more elegant. My mother had clasped a simple strand of pearls around my throat, the only jewelry of value we still possessed, and as I touched them, I felt the weight of all her hopes pressing against my skin. "You will be magnificent," she told me, and there were tears in her eyes. "You will walk into that ballroom, and they will see what I have always seen. A young woman worthy of love." I wanted to believe her. I wanted it so desperately that I could taste the longing on my tongue, sweet and sharp all at once. Our carriage was old, but serviceable, and my father drove it himself because we could no longer afford a coachman. The road to Hartwell Manor wound through the countryside, crossing a narrow stone bridge over the river before climbing the hill to the estate. It was a journey of perhaps 40 minutes, and I spent most of it in silence, my gloved hands clasped in my lap, my heart beating with a strange mixture of excitement and dread. We were perhaps 10 minutes from the manor when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the moonlight on the snow. But as our carriage drew closer to the bridge, the shadow took shape, and I realized with a jolt of alarm that it was a man lying motionless at the edge of the road. "Father!" I called out, my voice cutting through the cold air. "Stop the carriage." My father pulled the horses to a halt, and I could see the confusion on his face as he turned to look at me. "What is it, Rosalind?" "There is someone there," I said, already reaching for the carriage door. "On the road. I think he is hurt." My mother caught my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Rosalind, we cannot stop. We will be late." I looked at her, at the desperation in her eyes, and I understood what she was not saying. We could not afford to be late. We could not afford any misstep, any deviation from the careful plan she had constructed. The ball was everything, and a delay could mean missing the crucial introductions, the important moments that might determine my future. But there was a man lying in the snow, and he was not moving. "I cannot leave him," I said, and before she could protest further, I opened the door and stepped out into the night. The cold struck me like a physical blow, cutting through the thin fabric of my evening cloak and raising gooseflesh on my arms. But I hardly noticed as I hurried toward the figure on the ground, my silk slippers sliding on the icy stones. He was lying on his side, one arm stretched out as if he had been reaching for something when he fell. His clothes were simple, the rough wool coat and sturdy boots of a working man, and his face was half hidden by mud, and what I realized with a sickening lurch was blood. There was a wound on his forehead, a gash that had bled freely down his temple and jaw. I knelt beside him, not caring that the snow was soaking through my gown, and pressed my fingers to his throat. For one terrible moment I felt nothing, and then there it was, a pulse, faint but steady. He was alive. "Sir," I said, my voice trembling. "Sir, can you hear me?" He groaned, a low sound of pain, and his eyelids fluttered. I could see now that beneath the mud and blood he was perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a face that might have been handsome if it were not so pale and drawn. My father had climbed down from the carriage and was standing beside me, his expression troubled. "He seems to have taken a bad fall," he said, "perhaps thrown from a horse." "We must help him," I said. "We cannot leave him here. He will freeze." "Rosalind." My mother's voice came from the carriage, thin and strained. "The ball." I looked up at my father, and something passed between us, some understanding that I had not known we shared. He nodded slowly. "There is an inn," he said. "The Wayward Lamb. It is not far. We can take him there." "But the ball," my mother said again, and now I could hear the tears threatening to break through her careful composure. "Geoffrey, she has been waiting for this her entire life." I stood then, my ruined gown clinging to my legs, and looked at my mother with all the love and sorrow I felt. "Mother," I said gently, "I cannot dance in a ballroom while a man lies dying on the road because I was too concerned with my own future to help him. What sort of wife would I make if that were the measure of my character?" She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the war playing out across her features. Hope against duty, ambition against compassion. And then, slowly, her shoulders sagged, and she nodded. "You are right," she whispered. "Of course you are right. Help him." It took all three of us to lift the stranger into the carriage. He was heavier than he looked, and he groaned with every movement, though he did not fully regain consciousness. I sat beside him on the seat, cradling his head in my lap to keep it from striking the wooden frame as we drove. And I did not care that his blood was staining my beautiful blue gown, or that my pearls had come unclasped and fallen somewhere in the snow. The Wayward Lamb was a small establishment, the sort of place that catered to travelers and merchants rather than the gentry. The innkeeper, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Bramwell, took one look at the bleeding man in my arms and ushered us inside without question. We settled him in a room on the upper floor, and I set to work cleaning his wounds while my father went to fetch the local physician. The gash on his forehead was deep but clean, and I did my best to staunch the bleeding with strips torn from my own petticoat. There were other injuries as well, a badly bruised shoulder and what might have been cracked ribs, but he was breathing steadily, and his color was slowly returning. The physician arrived within the hour, an elderly man with kind eyes and steady hands. He examined the stranger thoroughly and pronounced that, while the injuries were significant, they were not life-threatening. Rest and care were what was needed, and time. My parents wanted to leave then, to take me home and salvage what we could of the evening, but I refused. "I cannot leave him alone," I said. "He has no one. What if he wakes and does not know where he is? And so they left me there, with promises to return in the morning, and I sat beside the stranger's bed as the hours passed, and the sounds of the winter ball drifted down from the distant manor like music from another world. He woke just before dawn. I had been dozing in the chair beside his bed, my head resting against my hand, when I felt him stir. I opened my eyes to find him looking at me, and I was struck immediately by the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were a deep shade of gray, like storm clouds over the sea, and they held mine with an awareness that seemed impossible for a man who had been unconscious mere hours before. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but there was authority in it, the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of being obeyed. "The Wayward Lamb," I said softly. "An inn near Hartwell. You were injured. We found you on the road." He frowned, and I saw him wince as the movement pulled at his wound. "I remember," he said slowly. "My horse. Something startled her. She threw me." "You are fortunate to be alive," I said. "A fall like that could have killed you." He was silent for a moment, studying me with those gray eyes. His gaze moved from my face to my ruined gown, taking in the blood and mud that stained the once beautiful silk. "You stayed with me," he said, "and it was not a question. Someone had to. But you were going somewhere." He gestured weakly at my gown. "A ball?" I felt my cheeks warm, though I could not say why. "It does not matter. It matters to me." He tried to sit up and gasped in pain, falling back against the pillows. "Tell me, please." And so I told him. I told him about the winter ball and my mother's hopes and the blue silk gown that had been meant to change my life. I told him about finding him on the road and the choice I had made, and as I spoke, something shifted in his expression, something I could not quite name. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Thank you." "There is no need to thank me," I said. "Anyone would have done the same." "No." His voice was firm despite its weakness. "They would not. Most would have driven past and told themselves it was not their concern. You stopped. You helped. You gave up your evening, your opportunity, for a stranger you did not know. That is not nothing, miss." "Whitmore," I said. "Rosalind Whitmore. Miss Whitmore." He smiled then, a faint curve of his lips that transformed his face. "I am in your debt." I shook my head. "You owe me nothing. Truly. I did only what was right." He seemed about to say something more, but exhaustion overtook him, and his eyes fluttered closed. Within moments, his breathing had deepened into sleep, and I settled back in my chair to keep watch once more. The morning brought my parents and a fresh change of clothes and the reality of what I had done. My mother's disappointment was palpable, though she tried to hide it beneath layers of practical concern. The gown was ruined beyond repair, the ball was over, the opportunity was lost. But as we prepared to leave, as I cast one last glance at the stranger sleeping in his bed, I felt something I had not expected to feel. Peace. I had made the right choice. I knew it in my bones, in the very depths of my soul, and whatever consequences might follow, I would not regret it. We returned home to our modest house on the edge of the county, and I tried to settle back into the quiet rhythm of my ordinary life. My mother did not speak of the ball, though I caught her sometimes staring at the place where my blue gown had hung, her eyes distant and sad. My father patted my shoulder and told me I had done well, and I treasured his approval more than I could say. 3 days passed. The snow melted and froze again, and the world continued to turn, indifferent to the hopes and heartbreaks of one unremarkable young woman. On the 4th day, everything changed. I was in the parlor, attempting to mend a tear in one of my everyday dresses, when I heard the sound of hooves on the drive. This was unusual enough to draw me to the window, and what I saw there made me drop my needlework and stare in disbelief. A carriage had stopped before our door. But this was no ordinary carriage. It was magnificent, gleaming black with gold trim, drawn by a matched pair of gray horses whose coats shone like polished silver. A coachman in full livery sat upon the box, and footmen were even now descending to open the door. "Mother," I called, my voice strange and distant in my own ears. "Father, you should come and see this." They joined me at the window just as the carriage door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a coat of dark blue superfine that fit him as if it had been sewn directly onto his body. His hair was dark, neatly arranged, and his face. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was him, the stranger from the road. But he was transformed. No longer pale and bloodied, but vibrant with health and power, every inch of him radiating the kind of authority that could only belong to someone born to command. "Good heavens," my mother breathed. "That is the Duke of Ashworth." I turned to look at her, uncomprehending. "The Duke of—" "Alaric Vane," she said, her voice trembling. "The Duke of Ashworth. He is one of the wealthiest men in England, and the most eligible bachelor in the entire kingdom." I looked back at the window just in time to see the Duke approach our front door. And then I heard the knock, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through the entire house. My father went to answer it. I heard the low murmur of voices in the entryway, and then footsteps, and then the parlor door opened, and the Duke of Ashworth walked into my life. He stopped just inside the threshold, and his eyes found mine immediately. They were the same storm-gray eyes that had studied me in that small room at the inn, but now they held something different. Purpose, determination, and beneath it all, a warmth that made my heart stutter in my chest. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was the same voice that had thanked me in the darkness, though stronger now, filled with life. "Your Grace," I managed, and I remembered just in time to curtsy, though my legs felt as unsteady as a newborn foal's. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and then, to my utter astonishment and the audible gasp of my mother, he knelt before me. Right there on the worn carpet of our modest parlor, the Duke of Ashworth went to one knee and bowed his head. "I owe you my life," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity. "You found me broken and bleeding on the road, and instead of continuing to your destination, instead of leaving me to my fate, you stopped. You cared for me. You stayed by my side through the night, and you asked for nothing in return." "Your Grace," I said, my own voice barely more than a whisper, "please, rise. This is not necessary." He looked up at me then, and there was something fierce in his gaze, something that would not be denied. "It is necessary," he said. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who would do anything for me because of my title, my wealth, my position. But you did not know who I was. You saw only a man in need, and you helped him. That is the rarest gift I have ever received." I could feel tears pricking at my eyes, though I could not have said why. "Anyone would have done the same," I said, repeating the words I had spoken to him in the inn. And as before, he shook his head. "No," he said firmly, "they would not. I have learned that lesson many times over. But you, Miss Whitmore, you are different, and I have come here today to ask if you would do me the honor of allowing me to repay my debt." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "Repay? I do not understand." He rose then, though he did not step back, and I found myself looking up into his face, so close that I could see the faint scar left by his wound, a thin line at his temple that would fade with time. "I would like to offer you a position in my household," he said, "as a companion to my aunt, the Dowager Duchess. She is in need of someone kind and sensible to keep her company, and I can think of no one better suited to the role." I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath behind me, but I could not look away from the Duke's eyes. This was more than generosity. This was an opportunity beyond anything I had ever dreamed, a chance to enter a world that had always been closed to me, to secure my future in a way that the winter ball never could have achieved. But something held me back. some stubborn spark of pride that would not allow me to accept charity, even from a duke, even from a man whose life I had saved. "Your Grace," I said carefully, "I am grateful for your offer. Truly. But I cannot accept payment for an act of basic human decency. I did not help you because I expected a reward." "I know," he said, and he smiled, that same faint curve of his lips that I remembered from the inn. "That is precisely why you deserve one." And so it was decided. Despite my protests, despite my reservations, the Duke of Ashworth was not a man who accepted refusal. Within a fortnight, I found myself installed in a suite of rooms at Thornwood Hall, the Duke's ancestral estate, with more space and comfort than I had ever known in my life. The Dowager Duchess, Lady Harriet Vane, was a formidable woman in her 70th year, with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had been skeptical of me at first, I could tell, wondering what sort of country nobody had captured her nephew's attention. But we quickly found common ground in our love of reading and our appreciation for direct conversation, and within a few weeks we had become something like friends. The Duke himself was often away, occupied with the endless duties that came with managing a vast estate and a prominent position in society. But when he was at Thornwood, he sought me out with a frequency that surprised me. He would find me in the library or the garden or the small sitting room where I took tea with his aunt, and he would linger, asking about my day, listening to my observations, sharing small pieces of himself in return. I learned that he was 32 years old and had inherited the dukedom at the age of 20 when his father died suddenly of a fever. I learned that he had no siblings, that his mother had passed when he was a boy, that his aunt was the closest thing to family he had left. I learned that he was weary of the social season and the endless parade of young women who saw only his title and his fortune and never bothered to look beyond. "I am so tired," he confessed to me one evening as we walked together in the winter garden, the bare branches of the roses reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. "Tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of being wanted for what I have rather than who I am." "I understand," I said softly, and I did. For I too had spent my life feeling invisible, overlooked, valued only for what I might bring to a marriage rather than for the person I was within. He stopped walking and turned to face me, and in the pale winter light his eyes seemed lighter than usual, almost silver. "You see me?" he said. "You truly see me." "I do," I whispered, "and I like what I see." Something shifted between us in that moment, something unspoken but unmistakable. The air seemed to thicken, to charge with an energy that made my skin tingle and my heart race. He took a step closer to me, and then another, and I found myself tilting my face up toward his as if drawn by an invisible force. But then a voice called out from the house, shattering the spell, and we sprang apart like guilty children. It was a servant summoning the Duke to receive an important visitor, and he went, though not before casting one last look at me over his shoulder. That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the canopy above me and trying to make sense of what I was feeling. It was impossible, of course. A duke could not marry a woman like me, a country nobody with no fortune and no connections. Such things did not happen outside of fairy tales. And yet I could not deny the flutter in my chest when I saw him, the warmth that spread through me when he smiled, the ache I felt when he went away. I was falling in love with Alaric Vane, and I did not know whether to be terrified or thrilled. Weeks passed, and the winter deepened, and my feelings grew in spite of my best efforts to suppress them. The Duke seemed to feel something too, I thought, though he never spoke of it directly. There were only those moments, those glances, those brushes of his hand against mine that seemed to linger longer than necessary. But there were others who noticed as well. Lady Prudence Ashby was the daughter of an earl and the acknowledged beauty of the season. She had set her sights on the Duke of Ashworth, and she made no secret of her intentions. She visited Thornwood often, always impeccably dressed, always armed with witty conversation and flirtatious glances, and she looked at me with barely concealed contempt, seeing in me a rival she refused to acknowledge as worthy. "You are aware, are you not," she said to me one afternoon, when we happened to be alone in the drawing room, "that your position here is temporary? The Duke is grateful to you, yes, but gratitude is not love. Once he has discharged his debt, you will be returned to the obscurity from which you came, and he will marry someone of his own station." I met her gaze steadily, refusing to let her see how her words stung. "You may be right," I said calmly. "But that is for the Duke to decide, not for you or me." Her eyes narrowed, and I saw true malice flash across her perfect features. "You think yourself clever," she hissed, "but you are nothing, a charity case, a curiosity. And when the Duke tires of you, I will be here, waiting." She swept from the room before I could respond, and I was left standing alone, my heart heavy and my confidence shaken. For all my bravado, I knew that she spoke the truth. I was not of their world. I did not belong here, and eventually, inevitably, I would have to leave. That night, I made a decision. I would not wait to be discarded. I would leave on my own terms, with my dignity intact. I would thank the Duke for his generosity and return to my family and my old life, and I would carry the memory of these precious months with me like a secret treasure, locked away in my heart forever. I went to find the Dowager Duchess to inform her of my plans. She was in her private sitting room, reading by the fire, and she looked up with surprise when I entered. "Rosalind," she said, using my Christian name as she had taken to doing in recent weeks. "Whatever is the matter? You look as if you have seen a ghost." I sat down across from her and told her everything. My feelings for the Duke, Lady Prudence's words, my decision to leave before I could be hurt any further. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then, to my astonishment, she began to laugh. "My dear girl," she said, shaking her head, "you are even more foolish than I thought." I stared at her, wounded. "I do not understand. Of course you do not." She leaned forward, her blue eyes piercing. "You think my nephew is kind to you because he feels obligated. You think his attention is mere gratitude. But I have known Alaric since he was a boy, and I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." My heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said firmly, "that my nephew is in love with you, you ridiculous creature. And if you leave now, you will break his heart." I shook my head, unwilling to believe it. But Lady Prudence said, "Lady Prudence is a scheming harpy who would say anything to remove you from her path." The Dowager Duchess snorted with unladylike derision. "Alaric cannot stand her. He tolerates her visits because her father is an important political ally, nothing more. But you, Rosalind, you are different. You are real. And that is something he has been searching for his entire life." I wanted to believe her. Oh, how I wanted to believe her. But years of disappointment had taught me to guard my heart, to expect nothing so that I could not be hurt. "Even if what you say is true," I said slowly, "it does not change the fundamental problem. I am not of his world. Society would never accept me as his duchess. Society," the Dowager Duchess said with magnificent disdain, "can go hang. My nephew is one of the most powerful men in England. He can marry whomever he chooses. And if he chooses you, then society will have no choice but to accept it." She reached out and took my hand, and her grip was surprisingly strong. "Do not run away from this, Rosalind. Do not let fear rob you of happiness. Talk to him, tell him how you feel, and let him tell you what is in his heart." I left her sitting room with my thoughts in turmoil and my emotions a tangled knot that I could not begin to unravel. Was it possible? Could the Duke of Ashworth truly love someone like me? I wandered through the halls of Thornwood, not really seeing where I was going, until I found myself standing before the door to the Duke's study. Light spilled from beneath the door, and I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper. He was awake. He was here. Before I could lose my nerve, I raised my hand and knocked. "Enter," came his voice, and I opened the door and stepped inside. He looked up from his desk, and his face transformed when he saw me, the stern lines of concentration melting into something softer, warmer. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising to his feet, "what brings you here at this hour? Is something wrong?" I closed the door behind me and stood with my back against it, my heart pounding so hard I thought he must surely hear it. "Your Grace," I said, and my voice trembled only slightly. "There is something I must say to you, something I should have said weeks ago." His expression grew serious, and he came around the desk to stand before me. "What is it?" I drew a deep breath and plunged forward before my courage could fail me. "I am going to leave Thornwood," I said. "I must return to my family. I cannot stay here any longer." Something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "Leave? But why? Have you been unhappy here?" "No," I said quickly. "I have been happier here than I have ever been in my life. And that is precisely the problem." He stared at me, uncomprehending. "I do not understand." And so I told him. I told him everything, all the feelings I had been hiding, all the fears that kept me awake at night. I told him about Lady Prudence's words and my own insecurities, and the certainty that I could never be worthy of someone like him. And as I spoke, I watched his face, searching for any sign of what he was thinking, but his expression remained unreadable. When I finished, I was trembling, and there were tears on my cheeks that I did not remember shedding. He had not said a word through my entire confession, and now the silence stretched between us like a chasm. "I should go," I whispered, turning toward the door. "I am sorry. I should not have." But before I could reach for the handle, his hand closed around my wrist, gentle but firm, and he turned me back to face him. "Rosalind," he said, and it was the first time he had ever used my Christian name. His voice was rough, almost broken. "Do you truly not know? Know what?" He stepped closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his body, could see the rapid pulse beating at his throat. "Do you truly not know that I have been in love with you since the moment I opened my eyes and saw you sitting beside my bed, covered in mud and blood, more beautiful than anyone I had ever seen?" I stared at him, speechless. "I have tried to tell you 100 times," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Every walk in the garden, every conversation by the fire, every time our hands touched. But I was afraid that you could not feel the same, afraid that I had imagined everything between us, afraid that if I spoke, I would lose you forever." "You could never lose me," I whispered. "Never." His hand released my wrist and rose to cup my face, his fingers warm against my cheek. "Then stay," he said. "Stay with me. Not as a companion to my aunt, but as my wife, my duchess, my partner in all things." "But society," I began, and he shook his head. "I do not care about society. I care only about you. I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, marrying the right person, saying the right things, playing the right part. But you have shown me that there is another way. You have shown me what it means to be truly seen, truly known, truly loved. And I will not give that up, not for society, not for anyone." "Alaric," I breathed, and his name felt like a prayer on my lips. He leaned forward, and I closed my eyes, and when his lips met mine, it was like coming home after a long journey. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then it deepened into something more, something that spoke of passion and promise and all the years we would have together. When we finally parted, I was breathless and laughing and crying all at once. "Is this truly happening?" I asked. "Am I dreaming?" "If you are dreaming," he said, "then so am I, and I never want to wake." The announcement of our engagement sent shockwaves through society. A duke marrying a country nobody? Scandal. Outrage. whispers in every drawing room from London to Bath. Lady Prudence was said to have taken to her bed for a week when she heard the news. But the Duke of Ashworth did not care. He had made his choice, and he stood by it with a firmness that silenced even the most vocal critics. And slowly, as the weeks passed and society saw the way he looked at me, the way I looked at him, the whispers began to change. Perhaps it was romantic after all. Perhaps true love could conquer even the boundaries of class. Perhaps there was something refreshing about a man who chose with his heart rather than his ledger books. The wedding was held in the spring, when the roses in the garden had begun to bloom and the air was sweet with the promise of new beginnings. I wore a gown of ivory silk, and my mother wept with joy as she watched me walk down the aisle. My father gave me away with trembling hands and shining eyes, and when I reached the altar, Alaric took my hands in his and looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. "I vow to love you," he said, his voice ringing through the chapel. "Today and tomorrow and every day after, in times of joy and times of sorrow, in sickness and in health, until death parts us and beyond. And I said, my voice steady despite the tears that blurred my vision, vow to stand beside you always, to be your partner and your friend, to see you as you truly are and love every part of what I see, today and tomorrow and forever." When he kissed me, there were cheers from the assembled guests, and when we turned to face them as husband and wife, I saw Lady Prudence in the crowd, her face a mask of forced politeness, and I felt nothing but pity for her. She had wanted Alaric for his title, his wealth, his position. But I had won something far more precious. I had won his heart. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. Thornwood Hall, which had once seemed so grand and intimidating, became my home in every sense of the word. I learned to manage the household, to host dinners and balls, to navigate the treacherous waters of society with the Dowager Duchess as my guide and ally. And through it all, Alaric was by my side, my husband, my partner, my love. We had our challenges, of course. There were those who never accepted me, who looked down their noses and whispered behind their fans. There were political crises and financial setbacks and all the ordinary struggles of life. But we faced them together, and in facing them, we grew only stronger. One evening, some 5 years after our wedding, I found myself standing on the terrace at Thornwood, watching the sun set over the gardens. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the warm summer air, and the sky was painted in shades of gold and crimson and purple. Alaric came to stand beside me, and I leaned into his warmth without thinking, as natural as breathing. "It is beautiful," I murmured. "It is," he agreed, "but not as beautiful as you." I laughed, turning to look at him. "After all these years, you still flatter me." "After all these years," he said, his gray eyes soft with love, "I still mean every word." He took my hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles. "I was thinking," he said, "about the night we met, about how different our lives would be if you had not stopped for me on that road." "I have thought about it too," I admitted. What if I had listened to my mother and continued on to the ball? What if I had been too afraid to help a stranger? "Then I would have died alone on that road," he said simply, "and I would never have known what it was to be truly loved." I turned to face him fully, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Alaric," I said softly, "I did not save you that night. You saved me." He frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "I spent my whole life believing I was ordinary," I explained. "Believing I was invisible, believing I had nothing special to offer the world. But you showed me that I was wrong. You showed me that kindness is not ordinary, that compassion is not weakness, that a heart full of love is the most precious gift anyone can possess." He gathered me into his arms and held me close, and I could feel his heart beating strong and steady against my own. "We saved each other," he said against my hair, "and we will continue to save each other every day for the rest of our lives." I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of roses and summer and the man I loved. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, we will." And so I find myself here, at the end of my tale, looking back on the journey that brought me from a modest house on the edge of the county to the grandest estate in England. It was not the path I expected. It was not the future my mother had planned for me when she commissioned that beautiful blue gown. But it was the path I was meant to walk, and I am grateful for every step. Sometimes, when the nights are quiet and the house is still, I take out a small box that I keep hidden in my private sitting room. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, is a strip of pale blue silk, stained with mud and blood, all that remains of the gown I wore on the night that changed my life. I look at it, and I remember. I remember the cold of the winter night and the weight of the stranger in my arms. I remember the fear and the hope and the choice that seemed so small at the time, but turned out to be everything. I missed the ball. I gave up my great opportunity. And in doing so, I found something far greater than anything a ballroom could have offered. I found love, true love, the kind that sees you as you truly are and cherishes every imperfect part. I found a home, not just a building of stone and wood, but a place where I belong, where I am valued, where I am never alone. I found myself, the woman I was always meant to be, strong and kind and worthy of happiness. And if there is a lesson in my story, it is this. Do not be afraid to stop for strangers. Do not be afraid to help those in need, even when it costs you something precious. Do not be afraid to choose kindness over ambition, compassion over propriety, love over everything else, because you never know. The stranger on the road might just turn out to be the love of your life. And the night you think you have lost might just be the beginning of everything you have ever dreamed. My name is Rosalind Whitmore, Duchess of Ashworth, and I am the happiest woman in all of England. Not because of my title or my wealth or my grand estate, but because I am loved, truly, deeply, completely loved, and that is worth more than any ball. The seasons turned as they always do. Summer melted into autumn, autumn frosted into winter, and each year brought new joys to treasure and new memories to hold. Thornwood Hall, which had once echoed with the lonely footsteps of a bachelor duke, now rang with laughter and conversation and the gentle bustle of a house that was truly lived in. I had found my place, not just as a duchess, but as a woman who had discovered her purpose. The local village, which had once regarded me with suspicion and curiosity, came to know me as a friend. I visited the sick and the elderly. I helped organize charitable events and fund improvements to the school. I listened to problems and offered what comfort and assistance I could. It was small work, perhaps, nothing that would earn me a mention in the history books. But it was meaningful work, and it filled my days with a sense of accomplishment that no ball or social triumph could ever match. Alaric watched my efforts with pride and admiration, and he joined me whenever his own duties allowed. Together, we became known not just as the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, but as a couple who cared for their community, who saw their privilege as a responsibility rather than a right. "You have changed me," Alaric told me one evening as we sat together in the library, the fire crackling in the hearth and the wind howling outside the windows. "Before you, I saw my position as a burden, a set of expectations I could never escape. But you have shown me that it can be something more, that power can be used for good, that wealth can create opportunity, that influence can lift up those who have been forgotten." I set down my book and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in mine. "You were always capable of these things," I said. "I merely helped you see what was already there." He smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made my heart flutter even after all our years together. "Perhaps, but I would never have found it without you." The Dowager Duchess remained a fixture in our lives, growing more eccentric and more beloved with each passing year. She had appointed herself the unofficial historian of our romance, telling and retelling the story of how we met to anyone who would listen. By her account, she had known from the very beginning that we were destined for each other, and she took full credit for encouraging me not to run away. "I saved this family," she would declare to the assembled guests at dinner parties. If not for my wise counsel, that stubborn girl would have fled back to her country cottage, and my nephew would still be moping about the house like a lovesick schoolboy. Alaric and I would exchange amused glances across the table, but we never contradicted her. There was enough truth in her telling after all, and it made her happy to play the role of fairy godmother in our tale. As for Lady Prudence, she eventually married an earl from the North Country and moved away from our social circle entirely. I heard rumors of her from time to time, reports that she was content enough in her grand estate, surrounded by the wealth and status she had always craved. I hoped, sincerely, that she had found some measure of happiness. We had been rivals once, but that seemed a lifetime ago, and I bore her no ill will. The world beyond Thornwood continued to turn as well. There were changes in government and society, advances in industry and technology that would have seemed like magic to my grandmother's generation. The rigid class structures that had defined my youth began, slowly, to soften. It was no longer quite so scandalous for a duke to marry for love, for a woman of modest means to rise to a position of prominence through her own merits. Perhaps we had played some small part in that change. Perhaps our example had shown others that such things were possible. Or perhaps we were simply fortunate to be living in an age of transition, when the old ways were giving way to something new. Either way, I was grateful. Grateful for the life I had been given. Grateful for the love that sustained me. Grateful for every morning I woke to find Alaric beside me, and every evening we spent together, talking and laughing and simply being. It was not always easy, of course. No life worth living is entirely free of struggle. There were times of sorrow and loss, moments when the weight of responsibility felt almost too heavy to bear. But through it all, we had each other. And that made all the difference. One autumn afternoon, many years after our first meeting, I found myself walking alone through the gardens of Thornwood. The leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and they crunched softly beneath my feet as I wandered down the familiar paths. I was no longer young. There was silver in my hair now, and the face that looked back at me from the mirror bore the gentle marks of time. But I did not mourn the passing of my youth. I had lived too fully to waste time on regret. I came at last to a bench tucked away in a quiet corner of the garden, sheltered by a hedge of boxwood and shaded by an ancient oak. This had become my favorite spot over the years, a place where I could sit and think and remember. And as I settled onto the weathered wood, I found my thoughts drifting back, as they so often did, to the night that had started it all. I could still see it so clearly, the frozen road gleaming in the moonlight, the dark shape of the stranger lying motionless in the snow, the weight of my decision pressing down on me as I stood at the crossroads of my fate. I had chosen kindness that night. I had chosen compassion. And in doing so, I had chosen myself, the person I truly was beneath all the expectations and fears and doubts. That choice had led me here, to this garden, to this life, to a love that had only deepened with time. I heard footsteps on the path behind me, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. Alaric settled onto the bench beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and together we looked out at the garden in comfortable silence. "What are you thinking about?" he asked at last, his voice soft and familiar. "The beginning," I said. "The night we met." He nodded slowly. "I think about it too, more often than you might imagine." I turned to look at him, at the face I had loved for so many years. His hair was gray now, and there were lines around his eyes and mouth, but he was still the most handsome man I had ever known, still the man who had knelt before me in my parents' parlor and asked me to share his life. "I have no regrets," I said. "Not a single one. I would make the same choice again, 1,000 times over." He took my hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "As would I," he said. as would I. We sat together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The air grew cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter to come. But I did not feel the cold. I was warm. I was safe. I was home. And I was loved. That is the end of my story, the tale of how I, an ordinary girl from a modest family, came to be a duchess. It is a story of chance and choice, of kindness rewarded and love discovered in the most unexpected of places. It is a story that I have lived every day of my life since that fateful winter night, and one that I will carry with me until my last breath. If you take nothing else from my tale, take this. Never underestimate the power of a single act of compassion. You may think it insignificant. You may think it will go unnoticed, unrewarded, forgotten. But you are wrong. Every kindness matters. Every choice counts. Every moment is an opportunity to change not just your own life, but the lives of those around you. I stopped for a stranger on the road. I missed the ball that was supposed to change my life. And in losing what I thought I wanted, I found something infinitely more precious. I found love. I found purpose. I found myself. And that is the greatest fairy tale of all. But perhaps you wonder about the details I have not yet shared. The small moments between the grand ones. The ordinary days that built the foundation of an extraordinary life. Allow me then to tell you more. In those first months at Thornwood Hall, before Alaric and I had confessed our feelings, before society had rendered its judgment, I learned what it truly meant to belong somewhere. It was not a sudden realization, but a gradual awakening. A slow unfurling of joy that caught me by surprise again and again. I remember the first morning I woke in my new chambers and did not immediately recognize where I was. The bed was so soft, the linen so fine, that for a moment I thought I must still be dreaming. Sunlight streamed through windows framed by velvet curtains the color of deep forest moss. And when I rose to look outside, I found myself gazing upon gardens that seemed to stretch forever, their winter bones elegant even in dormancy. A maid had been assigned to me, a cheerful young woman named Patience, who seemed determined to anticipate my every need before I knew I had it. She arrived that first morning with hot water for washing and a breakfast tray laden with more food than I could possibly eat. And she chattered happily about the household and its inhabitants while she helped me dress. The Dowager Duchess takes her breakfast in her private sitting room, Patience explained, as she fastened the buttons of my simple day dress. But she will expect you to join her by 10 o'clock. She is very particular about punctuality, miss. Very particular indeed. I thanked her and made my way through the corridors of Thornwood, marveling at the portraits that lined the walls and the way the morning light fell through tall windows onto floors polished to a mirror shine. The house was grander than anything I had ever experienced. But there was warmth here, too, a sense of history and continuity that made it feel less like a museum and more like a home that had been loved by generations. The Dowager Duchess received me in her sitting room, which was filled with comfortable furniture and the pleasant clutter of a life well lived. Books were stacked on every available surface, and a fat ginger cat lay curled before the fire, regarding me with the suspicious indifference that only felines can truly master. "Sit," Lady Harriet commanded, gesturing to the chair across from her own. "And tell me about yourself, Miss Whitmore. My nephew has told me very little, only that you saved his life and that he owes you a debt he can never repay. I should like to form my own opinions." And so I told her, not the grand story of the rescue, which she already knew, but the smaller truths of who I was. My love of books, my admiration for women who defied convention to pursue their passions, my secret belief that society's rules were often arbitrary and occasionally cruel, my fear that I would never find a place where I truly belonged. She listened without interruption, her sharp blue eyes fixed on my face, and when I finally fell silent, she nodded once, decisively. "You will do," she said. You are not a fool, which is more than I can say for most of the young women who have passed through this house hoping to catch my nephew's eye. And you are honest, which is rarer still. We shall get along very well, I think." It was not effusive praise, but from Lady Harriet, it was the highest compliment I could have received. The days took on a rhythm that I came to cherish. Mornings were spent with the Dowager Duchess, reading aloud to her or discussing the books we had both read, or simply sitting in companionable silence while she worked on her correspondence and I occupied myself with needlework. She was a demanding companion, but a rewarding one, and I found that she possessed a wealth of knowledge about the world that my sheltered upbringing had never provided. She told me about her own youth, about the marriage that had been arranged for her when she was barely 18 and the husband she had grown to love despite the inauspicious beginning. She told me about losing him too young and learning to navigate society as a widow, about the nephew she had helped to raise after his mother's death and her fears for his future. "He is a good man," she said one afternoon, her eyes distant with memory. "But he has been lonely for so long that I fear he has forgotten how to be otherwise. He needs someone who can see past the title and the responsibilities and find the man beneath. He needs someone who will love him for himself." I did not respond, could not respond, because my heart was too full of feelings I did not yet dare to name. But I thought about her words long afterward, turning them over in my mind like smooth stones worn by the sea. Afternoons were often my own, and I used them to explore the vast estate. Thornwood Hall sat at the center of thousands of acres, encompassing farms and forests and a village that owed its existence to the ducal family's patronage. I walked for hours, learning the paths that wound through the woods and the shortcuts that led to hidden clearings, discovering streams where fish darted beneath the surface and meadows where wildflowers would bloom when spring arrived. It was on one of these walks that I first encountered the Folly. It stood at the far edge of the formal gardens, half hidden by overgrown hedges and the creeping advance of wild roses. It was a small stone structure, built to resemble a ruined Greek temple, with columns that reached toward the sky and a domed roof open to the elements. Moss grew thick between the paving stones, and fallen leaves had gathered in the corners, giving the place an air of melancholy abandonment. I stood in the center of the Folly, surrounded by the ghosts of its former grandeur, and felt a strange kinship with this forgotten place. Like me, it had been built for a purpose that no longer seemed to matter. Like me, it had been left behind while the world moved on. I was so lost in my thoughts that I did not hear the footsteps approaching until a voice spoke behind me. "You have found my secret." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and found Alaric standing at the entrance to the Folly. He was dressed for riding, his boots muddy and his dark hair windswept, and there was an expression on his face that I could not quite read. "Your Grace," I said, and I hoped my voice did not betray how his sudden appearance had unsettled me. I did not mean to intrude. I was only walking, and He held up a hand, and I fell silent. "This was my mother's favorite place," he said, stepping into the Folly and looking around with eyes that saw something beyond the present decay. "She had it built the year I was born. She would come here to read, to think, to escape the demands of the house. After she died, my father could not bear to look at it. He ordered the gardeners to let it fall into disrepair, as if by erasing her sanctuary, he could somehow ease his grief. "I did not know," I said softly. "I am sorry." He shook his head, and when he looked at me there was something raw and vulnerable in his gaze. "You are the first person to find this place in years," he said. "Most of the household has forgotten it exists. But I come here sometimes when I need to feel close to her. She died when I was so young that I have very few memories of my own. But here, surrounded by the beauty she loved, I can almost imagine what she might have been like." I did not know what to say, what comfort I could offer to a man who had lost so much so young. But I reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of sympathy that felt inadequate, but was all I had to give. He looked down at my hand on his sleeve, and then up at my face, and something shifted in the air between us. For a long moment, neither of us moved or spoke. The folly was silent around us, and the world beyond its crumbling walls seemed very far away. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" I asked. "For seeing," he said. "For understanding. For being here." He did not say anything more, but he did not need to. The connection that had begun to form between us on that winter night when I had knelt beside his broken body had grown stronger, taking root in the soil of shared vulnerability and mutual recognition. We were two lonely souls who had found each other in the darkness, and though neither of us dared to speak of what that might mean, we both knew that something had changed. From that day forward, the folly became our place. We met there often, sometimes by design and sometimes by chance, and we talked for hours about everything and nothing. I learned about his duties and his burdens, the endless weight of expectation that had been placed upon his shoulders before he was old enough to understand what it meant. He learned about my dreams and my disappointments, the life I had left behind, and the future I feared to hope for. We were careful, always. We maintained the proper distance that society demanded. We never touched except in the most innocent of ways, but the walls we had built around our hearts were crumbling as surely as the walls of the folly, and with every conversation, every shared silence, every look that lasted a moment too long, we moved closer to a precipice from which there would be no retreat. The winter deepened, and Christmas approached, bringing with it a flurry of activity at Thornwood Hall. The Dowager Duchess was determined that the holiday should be celebrated properly, and she drafted me into her service as she orchestrated the decoration of the house and the planning of the feast. "We must have greenery," she announced, surveying the great hall with a critical eye. "Holly and ivy and mistletoe, and a Yule log, of course. This house has been far too somber for far too long. It is time to remember what joy feels like." I threw myself into the preparations with enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction from my increasingly complicated feelings. Together with the household staff, I helped to festoon the banisters with garlands and to set candles in every window. I supervised the arrangement of the kissing bough and tried not to think about who might stand beneath it. I helped to plan a menu that would have fed a small army and ensured that gifts were prepared for every servant and tenant on the estate. On Christmas Eve, the great hall was transformed. Firelight flickered on walls hung with greenery, and the air was thick with the scents of cinnamon and cloves and roasting meat. The household gathered around the Yule log as it was carried in with great ceremony, and there was singing and laughter and a warmth that I had not expected to find in this grand and ancient house. Alaric was there, of course playing the role of generous host with an ease that I knew cost him more effort than he let show. He moved among his people, sharing a word with this servant and a smile with that one, ensuring that everyone felt seen and valued. And when his eyes found mine across the crowded room, when he raised his glass in a silent toast meant only for me, I felt my heart swell with an emotion I could no longer deny. I loved him. I loved him with a depth and intensity that frightened me, because I knew that such love could only lead to heartbreak. I was not his equal. I could never be his wife. And yet, I could not stop the feeling from growing, could not stem the tide of longing that rose within me every time he drew near. The feast was magnificent. Course after course of dishes, prepared with skill and generosity. There was roast goose and game pie and plum pudding and wine that flowed freely as the night wore on. The Dowager Duchess presided over the table like a benevolent queen, her sharp tongue softened by the spirit of the season, and even Lady Prudence, who had contrived to secure an invitation despite not being wanted, could not dampen the festive atmosphere. After dinner, there was dancing. A quartet of musicians had been engaged for the evening, and they played reels and waltzes while the company whirled around the floor. I had never been much of a dancer, my lessons limited by my family's circumstances, but I found myself swept up in the joy of the music nonetheless. And then Alaric was before me, His hand extended, his gray eyes bright with something that looked almost like hope. "May I have this dance, Miss Whitmore?" I should have refused. I knew what it would look like, what people would say. But I was tired of being careful, tired of denying myself even this small pleasure. And so I placed my hand in his and allowed him to lead me onto the floor. The waltz was slow and beautiful, and in Alaric's arms, I felt as though I were floating. He moved with a grace that came from years of practice, guiding me effortlessly through the steps I only half remembered. And when he looked down at me, when his hand tightened ever so slightly on my waist, I saw in his eyes the same longing that burned within my own heart. "Rosalind," he breathed, so softly that only I could hear. But whatever he had been about to say was lost as the music swelled to its conclusion and the other dancers pressed close around us. The moment was gone, slipped away like water through cupped hands, and when the dance ended, we stepped apart with the polite formality that the occasion demanded. I excused myself shortly afterward, claiming fatigue from the long evening. But when I reached my chambers and closed the door behind me, I stood for a long time at the window, looking out at the frost-covered gardens and the stars that blazed cold and bright above. I did not know what to do. I did not know how to navigate these treacherous waters where every look and every touch threatened to sweep me under. I only knew that I was drowning, and that the man I loved was drowning too, and that neither of us seemed to have the strength to reach the shore. The days after Christmas passed in a blur of activity as Thornwood prepared for the new year. The guests who had arrived for the holiday festivities lingered on, filling the house with chatter and demands, and I found myself busier than ever, attending to the Dowager Duchess and helping to manage the endless social obligations. Lady Prudence remained, her presence a constant irritation that I tried to ignore. She had clearly not given up on her pursuit of the Duke, and she took every opportunity to insert herself into his company, laughing too loudly at his remarks and touching his arm with a familiarity that made my blood simmer with an emotion I refused to name as jealousy. But if I was watching her, she was also watching me. I caught her eyes on me more than once, cold and calculating, and I knew that she saw more than I wished her to see. She was a woman who understood ambition, who recognized it in others. And though I was not truly her rival, not really, she treated me as one nonetheless. The confrontation came on a gray January afternoon, in the empty drawing room where I had sought refuge from the noise and bustle of the house. I was sitting by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, when the door opened and Lady Prudence swept in. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. How fortuitous. I was hoping we might have a word. "Of course," I said, rising to my feet and schooling my features into an expression of polite neutrality. "How may I help you, Lady Prudence?" She circled the room slowly, like a cat stalking its prey, and when she spoke again, all pretense of friendliness had been stripped away. "You are not as clever as you think," she said. "I know what you are doing. I know what you want. I beg your pardon? You want him." She stopped before me, her beautiful face twisted with disdain. "You want the Duke. You think that by playing the role of modest companion, by ingratiating yourself with his aunt, you can somehow climb into a position above your station. But you are wrong, Miss Whitmore. You are nothing. You have nothing. And when Alaric finally sees you for what you truly are, he will cast you aside without a second thought." I felt the blood drain from my face, but I refused to let her see how deeply her words had cut. "Whatever you imagine you see, Lady Prudence," I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will, "I assure you that you are mistaken. I am here as a companion to the Dowager Duchess, nothing more. The Duke owes me a debt of gratitude, which he has repaid many times over through his generosity. There is nothing improper between us." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that held no humor. "Gratitude," she repeated. "Is that what they are calling it these days? I have seen the way he looks at you, Miss Whitmore. I have seen the way you look at him, and I am telling you now for your own sake that it will end in disaster. He may be infatuated with you for the moment, but infatuation fades, and when it does, you will be left with nothing. No position, no prospects, no reputation. Is that truly what you want?" I did not answer, could not answer, because the truth was that I did not know. I did not know what I wanted, except that I wanted him, wanted to be with him, wanted to believe that the connection between us was real and lasting. But Lady Prudence's words had sharpened all the fears I had been trying to suppress, and I felt suddenly cold, suddenly alone, suddenly aware of how precarious my position truly was. She seemed to take my silence as confirmation of her victory. "Remember what I have said," she told me, sweeping toward the door with the arrogance of one who has never been denied anything she wanted. "And when you are packing your bags and returning to your country hovel, remember that I tried to warn you." The door closed behind her, and I sank back into my chair, trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. I hated her. I hated her certainty and her cruelty and her assumption that I was nothing more than a social climber seeking to advance myself through dubious means. But I hated even more the part of me that feared she might be right. That night, unable to sleep, I made the decision that would change everything. I would speak to Alaric. I would confess my feelings, not because I hoped for any particular outcome, but because I could no longer bear the weight of my silence. Whatever happened, whatever he said in response, at least I would know. At least the uncertainty would be over. But when I went to find the Dowager Duchess the next morning, when she took my hand and told me not to run away, when she urged me to trust in what I felt and what I saw, my resolve strengthened into something new, something that felt almost like hope. And so I found myself standing before the door of his study, my heart in my throat and my future hanging in the balance. And when I knocked, when I stepped inside, when I told him everything I had been hiding, I did not know what would happen next. I only knew that I had chosen honesty over fear, and that whatever came of it, I would not regret the choice. You know what happened next. You know that he loved me too, that he had been as afraid as I was, that our confessions met in the air between us and transformed into something beautiful. You know about the proposal and the wedding and the years of happiness that followed. But what you may not know, what I have not told you until now, is how close I came to losing everything. It was a month before the wedding, when the preparations were well underway and society had begun, grudgingly, to accept that the Duke of Ashworth truly intended to marry a nobody from the country. I was in London with Alaric and Lady Harriet, selecting fabrics for my trousseau, when the letter arrived. It was addressed to me, written in an elegant hand I did not recognize, and when I opened it, I found inside a single sheet of paper covered in accusations and threats. The letter claimed to have proof that I had orchestrated my meeting with the Duke, that I had deliberately injured him in order to play the role of rescuer, that my kindness on the road had been nothing more than a calculated scheme to entrap a wealthy man. It threatened to reveal this proof to society, to ruin me utterly, unless I agreed to end the engagement and leave England forever. I read the words twice, 3 times, my hands shaking so badly that the paper rattled in my grip. The accusations were absurd, of course. I had done nothing of the kind, but I knew how society worked, knew how quickly rumor could become accepted truth, knew that once such allegations were made, they could never be fully undone. I thought about keeping it secret, about trying to handle the situation on my own. But I had learned in my time at Thornwood that secrets were poison. And so I went to Alaric and showed him the letter and watched his face darken with fury as he read. "This is monstrous," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Someone is trying to destroy you, trying to destroy us." "Do you believe it?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded, how vulnerable. "Do you believe what they say?" He crossed to me in 2 strides and took my face in his hands, forcing me to meet his eyes. "Never!" he said fiercely. "Not for a single moment. I know who you are, Rosalind. I know your heart, and nothing anyone says or does will ever make me doubt you. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Alaric engaged the best investigators in London, and within a week, they had traced the letter to its source, Lady Prudence Ashby. She had written it herself, or had it written by an accomplice, and she had intended to deliver more damning evidence if her initial threat did not achieve its purpose. But her plan had unraveled under scrutiny, and when confronted with the proof of her deception, she had broken down in tears and confessed everything. I hated you, she told me when I went to see her one final time before she was sent away in disgrace. I hated that you had what I wanted. I hated that he chose you over me. I thought if I could take it away from you, if I could ruin you, he would finally see that I was the better choice. I looked at her, at the beautiful face now blotched with tears and twisted with shame, and I felt something I had not expected. Pity. I am sorry, I said softly. I am sorry that you were so unhappy that you felt you had no choice but to hurt others. I hope that someday you will find peace. She stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign tongue, and perhaps to her I had. Kindness was not a language she understood. The scandal was hushed up, as scandals among the nobility often were. Lady Prudence was quietly sent to live with relatives in Scotland, and the letter was destroyed, and the story was never spoken of again. But it had taught me something important. It had taught me that the world would always try to tear down those who dared to rise above their station, and that the only defense against such attacks was the unwavering love of those who knew the truth. Alaric had stood by me. He had believed in me. And when we finally spoke our vows in the chapel at Thornwood, surrounded by the scent of spring roses and the warmth of gathered friends, I knew that I was marrying a man who would stand by me through anything. The years that followed were not without their challenges. We navigated the complexities of society, learning when to compromise and when to stand firm. We built relationships with those who had initially scorned us and won respect through the consistency of our actions. We became known, as I said before, as a couple who cared for their community, who used their privilege for good. And through it all, our love continued to grow. It deepened with every shared sunrise and every quiet evening. It strengthened with every challenge we faced together and every joy we celebrated. It became the foundation upon which our entire lives were built, solid and unshakable, a rock in the midst of an ever-changing sea. I have spoken of the Dowager Duchess, of her wit and her wisdom, and her role in our story. But I have not told you about the day she left us. It was 7 years after my marriage, on a soft spring morning when the gardens were alive with new growth, and the air was sweet with the promise of summer. Lady Harriet had been ill for some months, her formidable spirit slowly waning as her body failed her. We had known the end was coming, had prepared ourselves as best we could, but when the moment arrived, it still felt like a blow. I was with her when she passed. Alaric had been called away on urgent business, and she had asked me to stay, to hold her hand, to talk to her about the life she had lived and the love she had witnessed. You were the best thing that ever happened to this family, she told me. Her voice barely a whisper, but her eyes still bright with intelligence. You brought life back to Thornwood. You brought joy back to my nephew. And you showed us all that love is more powerful than any title or fortune. I wept then, unable to hold back the tears any longer. You did the same for me, I said. You gave me a home. You gave me a family. You gave me the courage to believe I deserved happiness. She smiled, that sharp and knowing smile I had come to love so dearly. Of course you deserved it, she said. I knew it from the moment I met you. You just needed someone to remind you. She closed her eyes then, and her hand went slack in mine, and I sat with her in the quiet of the morning as her spirit slipped away. And though my heart was breaking, I also felt a strange sense of peace. She had lived a full life. She had loved and been loved. and she had left this world knowing that the family she had devoted herself to was in good hands. We buried her in the family plot at Thornwood, beside the husband she had lost so many years before. The entire county came to pay their respects, and the chapel was filled with flowers and tears and the kind of genuine grief that only accompanies the loss of someone truly remarkable. Alaric spoke at the service, his voice steady, but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He spoke of her strength and her wisdom, her sharp tongue and her tender heart. He spoke of the role she had played in his life, the mother figure she had become after his own mother's death. And he spoke of how she had welcomed me into the family, recognizing something in me that I had not yet learned to see in myself. After the service, we walked together to the Folly, that crumbling temple that had become our sanctuary. The wild roses that had overtaken it were in bloom now, their petals soft and fragrant, and the moss between the stones was green and lush. She would have wanted us to be happy, I said, leaning against Alaric's shoulder as we stood amid the ruins. She would not want us to mourn forever. I know, he said, but I will miss her. I will miss her every day for the rest of my life. So will I. We stood there for a long time, holding each other, drawing comfort from the warmth and solidity of each other's presence. And when we finally turned to go, to return to the house and the duties that awaited us, I felt something shift within me. I had come to Thornwood as a stranger, uncertain of my place and afraid of my feelings. But I was a stranger no longer. This was my home. These were my people. And the love that had brought me here would sustain me through whatever challenges lay ahead. The years continued to pass, as years do. We grew older, Alaric and I, but our love only grew deeper. We faced losses and celebrated victories. We weathered storms and basked in seasons of peace. And through it all, we held to each other. Two souls who had found their match in a world that so often seemed designed to keep such souls apart. I think often of the girl I was, the girl who stood before the mirror in her blue silk gown, hoping that a single night might change her life. She could not have imagined where her journey would lead. She could not have foreseen the love and the heartbreak, the challenges and the triumphs, the full and magnificent life that awaited her. But I am grateful for her. Grateful for her kindness, her compassion, her willingness to stop for a stranger on a cold winter night. She made the choice that set everything in motion. She took the first step on a path that would lead to more happiness than she had ever dared to dream. And if I could speak to her now, if I could reach back through the years and offer her just one piece of wisdom, it would be this. Trust your heart, trust your instincts. Trust the still small voice within you that knows what is right, even when the world tells you otherwise. That voice will never lead you astray. The ball does not matter. The gown does not matter. The expectations and the judgments and the opinions of others do not matter. What matters is who you are in the deepest part of your soul, and whether you have the courage to be that person fully and completely, no matter the cost. I had that courage. I found it on a frozen road, in the snow beside a stranger who would become my everything. And it has never failed me since. My name is Rosalind Vane, Duchess of Ashworth. I was born into a family of fading gentility and modest means. I was told my entire life that I was ordinary, unremarkable, destined for nothing more than a quiet existence on the margins of society. But I proved them wrong. Not through beauty or wealth or social connection, but through the simple act of choosing compassion over convenience, love over fear, and hope over despair. That is my story. That is my legacy. And that is the gift I leave to you, whoever you are, wherever you may be, whatever dreams you hold in your heart. Never give up on those dreams. Never stop believing that you are worthy of love and happiness and all the beautiful things this world has to offer. And never, ever forget that the smallest act of kindness can change not just one life, but countless lives, rippling outward through time like waves upon the water. I stopped for a stranger on the road, and in stopping, I found my destiny. May you find yours as well. But before I close this tale, before I set down my pen and let silence take the place of words, allow me to share one final memory. One moment that captures, perhaps better than any other, the essence of the life I have been blessed to live. It was an autumn evening, many years after all the events I have described. The leaves had turned to gold and copper, and the air carried that particular crispness that heralds the coming of winter. I was sitting in the drawing room at Thornwood, a book open in my lap, though I had not turned a page in some time. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling timbers. Alaric entered without a word and crossed to where I sat. He lowered himself onto the settee beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. We had reached that stage of marriage where words were often unnecessary, where a look or a touch could convey more than hours of conversation. "What are you thinking about?" he asked finally, and I heard in his voice the same warmth that had drawn me to him all those years ago. "Everything," I said. "Nothing. The way time passes, the way life unfolds in ways we never expect." He took my hand, threading his fingers through mine. "Are you happy?" I turned to look at him, at the face I loved more than any other in the world. His hair was silver now, as was mine, and the years had left their marks upon us both. But his eyes were the same, those storm-gray eyes that had first met mine in a small room at the Wayward Lamb, and they still held the same depth, the same intensity, the same love. "Yes," I said simply, "I am happy, more happy than I ever imagined possible." He lifted our joined hands and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, a gesture he had made 1,000 times before, but that still made my heart flutter like a girl's. "As am I," he said, "as am I." We sat together in the firelight, watching the flames dance and feeling the weight of all our shared years settling around us like a comfortable blanket. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called its haunting song. But inside, we were warm. We were safe. We were home. I thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The frozen road, the wounded stranger, the choice to stop. The kneeling Duke, the whispered confessions, the wedding vows, the years of building a life together, brick by brick, day by day, until we had constructed something beautiful and lasting. So many things could have gone differently. So many paths could have led elsewhere. But somehow, miraculously, all those paths had converged to bring us here, to this moment, to this life we had created together. "Do you remember," Alaric said softly, "the first time you came to the Folly?" I smiled, the memory rising unbidden. "You startled me. I thought I was alone. You were standing in the center of the ruins, looking so lost and so beautiful. I remember thinking that you looked like you belonged there, like you had always been there, waiting for me to find you." I did not feel like I belonged anywhere, I admitted. Not then. I felt like a pretender, a trespasser in a world that was not meant for me. He turned to face me fully, his expression serious. "And now?" I considered the question carefully before I answered. "Now," I said, "I know that belonging is not about where you were born, or what name you carry, or how much money fills your coffers. Belonging is about love, about being seen and accepted for who you truly are, about finding your people and holding on to them with everything you have. And by that measure, I belong here more than I have ever belonged anywhere." He smiled, that slow smile that still had the power to make my breath catch. "That," he said, "is exactly right." We talked for hours that night, reminiscing about the past and musing about the future, sharing stories we had told 100 times before, but that never grew old in the telling. We talked about Lady Harriet and her indomitable spirit. We talked about my parents, who had lived long enough to see me settled and happy, before passing peacefully within a year of each other. We talked about the friends we had made and the enemies we had conquered and all the ordinary miracles that make up an extraordinary life. And when at last the fire burned low and the candles guttered in their holders, when the night had grown deep and the stars blazed bright through the tall windows, we rose and made our way upstairs, arm in arm, step by step, just as we had done every night for more years than I could count. At the door to our chambers, Alaric paused and turned to me. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For stopping. For staying. For choosing me, even when the world told you not to. For every single day we have had together. I am grateful for all of it, every moment, every memory, every breath." I reached up and touched his face, tracing the lines that time had etched there. Lines I knew as well as I knew my own. "And I am grateful for you," I said. "For your courage, for your love, for never giving up on us, even when it would have been easier to let go. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Alaric Vane, and I would do it all again, exactly the same, just to end up here with you." He leaned down and kissed me, soft and sweet and full of promise, a kiss that held within it all the passion of our youth and all the tenderness of our age. And when we finally drew apart, when we finally stepped through the door and into the night that awaited us, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. There is a particular kind of happiness that comes from a life well lived. Not a life without hardship, not a life without loss, but a life that has been filled with love and meaning and purpose. It is a quiet happiness, a steady happiness, the kind that glows like embers rather than blazing like a bonfire. But it is no less powerful for its gentleness, no less precious for its constancy. I have known that happiness. I have lived it, breathed it, held it close to my heart like a talisman against the darkness. And though I know that nothing in this world lasts forever, though I know that someday even this beautiful life must come to an end, I do not fear the future. I do not dread what is to come. Because I know that I have loved and been loved. I know that I have made a difference, however small, in the lives of those around me. I know that my story, our story, will live on in the hearts of those who knew us, passed down through generations like a treasured heirloom. And I know, with a certainty that goes beyond reason, that love does not end with death, that the connection Alaric and I have forged will endure beyond the boundaries of this mortal life, that wherever we go, whatever comes next, we will find each other again. We will always find each other. That is my faith. That is my hope. That is the truth I hold on to when the nights grow dark and the world seems cold. Love is stronger than death. Love is stronger than anything. And the love I have known, the love I have lived, is proof of that eternal truth. So here I am, at the end of my story, and I find that I have nothing more to say. The words have all been spoken. The tale has been told. All that remains is to set down my pen and step away from the page, to return to the life that awaits me beyond these written lines. But before I go, let me leave you with one final thought. One last piece of wisdom from an old woman who has seen much and learned more. Life is short. Too short for regret, too short for fear, too short for anything but love. So love fiercely, love bravely, love with your whole heart, holding nothing back, risking everything for the chance at true connection. And if you find yourself on a frozen road one winter night, faced with a choice between your own ambitions and the welfare of a stranger, do not hesitate. Stop. Help. Give of yourself without counting the cost. Because that choice, that simple act of kindness, may be the beginning of something more beautiful than you could ever imagine. It was for me. My name is Rosalind Vane, Duchess of Ashworth, and I am the luckiest woman who ever lived. Not because of my title, not because of my wealth, not because of the grand estate I call home, but because I stopped for a stranger on a cold winter night, and in stopping, I found my heart. That is my story. That is my truth. and I would not change a single word of it.